This morning I wish to tell you an Easter story. At first you may wonder how the story that I'm about to tell could possibly be an Easter story. But before I'm done, I hope that you'll see what I mean. The story that I want to talk about this morning is a little story that can be found in a little 4-chapter book in the Old Testament called the Book of Ruth. You can find it right between Judges and 1 Samuel in the Old Testament of your Bible. And I think one of the most important questions that we can ask when we look at a particular Bible passage is, why did God choose to put this passage in His Word? So let's start there. There are many things that God could have done with those short pages of the book of Ruth. Why did He choose to give us that particular story? And to be sure, it's an interesting story. It's a rags to riches story. It's a Cinderella story of sorts. A pitifully poor but beautiful young woman catches the eye of the rich and influential land baron, and he saves her from a life of shame. It's the sort of story that most people find most interesting, and I certainly think that God wants you to find the Bible interesting. But I'm also certain that God has other ideals in mind other than simply to entertain us. And yet on an initial reading, when you just read through the book from beginning to end, it appears maybe not to be anything more than just that, just a simple, entertaining story. And I think most people that read this book probably come away thinking that that's all there is to it. It's just an interesting story from the history of Israel. However, I want to prove to you this morning that Ruth is more than simply an entertaining narrative. It's a portal into the mind of God Himself. And what it reveals about God's mind is that you, individually, you are very important to God. That He thinks of you constantly. And that He strongly desires that all things would be right between you and Him. The book of Ruth is about events that took place about 1,300 years before Christ. But the context to the book of Ruth actually began with a person by the name of Lot, who lived about 600 years before Ruth did. Lot's story can be found in the book of Genesis. If you look at Genesis chapters 13, 14, you don't have to turn there now, but if you're interested in his story, it's found in Genesis 13, 14, 18, and 19. And Lot was a nephew of Abraham, the father of Israel. And Lot migrated with Abraham from what is modern-day Iraq to Palestine. And while Lot lived with Abraham, he was very successful. In fact, Lot actually became rich during the time that he was living with Abraham. But he started making some bad decisions. At first, these decisions were simple little decisions that seemed innocent enough. The first such decision was that when, for economic reasons, he decided to move away from the place where Abraham lived. And the place where Abraham was a place named Bethel. And that's interesting because Bethel means house of God. And perhaps you or one of your ancestors has at one time decided to move away from the house of God. And it seems like such a simple decision at first, but then life gets more and more complicated, and the initial bad decision leads to other bad decisions until the end result is a ruined life. And that's pretty much what Lot did in the time after he chose to move away from the house of God and away from Abraham. Eventually, that initial decision and the decisions after that cost him the lives of his wife and his 2 sons-in-law. He lost his home and everything that he owned. The once wealthy man ended up living in a cave with his 2 daughters. That's not the end of his story, though. The 2 daughters became pregnant by him in an incestuous relationship that he had with each of them. In fact, one of the daughters gave birth to a boy who she named Moab. And Moab actually means son of a father. So the actual name of one of the children was basically implied that the baby daddy was also the granddad. So Lot started off well and ended terribly. And so it was that from Lot's son, who was also his grandson, on down, the descendants of this little boy Moab were a very evil people right from the start. They were called the Moabites, and they settled in an area that's to the east of the Dead Sea. They were not nice people. They were not good people. They worshipped a god named Chemosh, or you may pronounce it Chemosh. And one of the things that they did in the worship of this god was they sacrificed their children to this god. Ruth was a descendant of Moab. Ruth was a Moabitess, they called her, or we call her, I guess. So the first thing that you need to know about Ruth is that she descended from a long line of evil people dating back to an incestuous relationship between a caveman and his daughter. And the Bible makes it quite clear that God did not care for the things that these people did. Twice in the book of Psalms, Psalm 60 verse 8 and Psalm 108 verse 9, God refers to Moab as his washpot. Now when you wash dishes in a sink, when you're done washing them, what's left in the sink after you're done? There's pieces of scum and waste that were on the dishes. So I think what God is implying by calling Moab his washpot is that the Moabites were full of waste and scum. That's not a very good rating from God for the Moabites. When the Israelites were moving from Egypt to Canaan, the Moabites were worried about them, and they hired someone by the name of Balaam. And Balaam was the sort of person that we would today refer to as a shaman or a witch doctor. And they hired him to place a curse on Israel. In several places in the Bible, the Israelites got themselves into trouble by intermarrying with the Moabites. Perhaps the best way to understand what it is that God thought about the Moabites is to look at Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 3 and 4, which tells us, "A Moabite shall not enter the congregation of the Lord, even to the 10th generation, none of his descendants shall enter the congregation of the Lord forever." It's kind of a harsh thing for God to say. "A Moabite shall not enter the congregation even to the 10th generation. None of his descendants shall enter the congregation of the Lord." 10 generations is a long time. Just to give you an idea of how long a time 10 generations is, my son has traced my family back many generations. So I counted 10 generations back in my own family, and I picked somebody. Henry Adams was married to Edith Squire. Henry and Edith lived in the 15 and 1600s. In addition to being my ancestors, they were also the great-grandparents of our second president, John Adams. According to Deuteronomy 23, if Henry and Edith Adams had been Moabites living in Israel, I would be the 10th generation. My son would be the first generation that would be allowed to participate in the worship of the one true God as a part of Israel. I was born, Edith lived to be 85 years old, and I was born 297 years after she died. So more than 300 years, God was shutting out the people of Moab. That's quite a curse. It would seem that God was very intent on not allowing this bastard people into his kingdom. At this point, you may be wondering where I'm going with this sermon, because I started out telling you how much God values you, and then I proceeded to tell you about this whole group of people called the Moabites that he would not even allow to be with him. He wouldn't allow his people even to associate with them. So which God is he? Is he the loving, inclusive God that I originally told you about? Or is he the harsh, unyielding God who is ready to damn people for their own sins and for the sin nature that they received from their ancestors? Which God is he? The answer is that he is both. Now, if you tend to be self-righteous and judgmental, you may be uncomfortable knowing that God really wants everyone in his family. And if you tend to be more libertine in your approach, you may be uncomfortable knowing that God really does intend to judge you and everyone else. And yet both things are true of God's nature. And Abraham summed up the dichotomy pretty well in Genesis 18 when he said, "Shall not the judge of all the earth do right?" Yes, God is the austere judge of all the earth. But we would do well to remember that implicit in that question that Abraham asked, shall not the judge of all the earth do right? He was talking to God about whether or not he would destroy Sodom and Gomorrah if certain conditions existed. And God agreed that under certain circumstances, he would not destroy Sodom. But we would also do well to remember that in the end, he did destroy Sodom. The Bible clearly teaches a loving, kind, forgiving, merciful God. The Bible also teaches an austere and judgmental God. Both are true. The Bible teaches both. The question then is, how do we reconcile the two? As humans, we really can't reconcile the two, but God can. And when we begin to study how he has done so, we discover a thing of exquisite beauty, a thing which could not exist without the attributes of the magnificent God of the Bible. And this beauty shines bright in the book of Ruth. Ruth is a beautiful book. So let's go now to the book of Ruth, and I'm going to start reading it. Let's look at verse 1 of chapter 1 of the book of Ruth. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. Now the first verse tells us a lot. First of all, it tells us that this story took place in the days of the Judges. The book of Judges comes immediately before the book of Ruth, and perhaps the best way to sum up the days of the book of Judges is with this key passage that appears 3 times in the book of Judges. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. And so what we have here in the first verse of the book of Judges is a very good example of someone doing what was right in his own eyes. Any man who lived in Bethlehem during that time was aware that God had repeatedly told his people to have nothing to do with the Moabites. Any man of Bethlehem would have known about Numbers 25, which tells of the Israelites being led astray by the Moabites and therefore bringing upon themselves God's judgment. Any man of Bethlehem would have known about the 10 generations rule, the command to stay away from those who were descendants of Moab for 10 generations. The instructions were clear. Stay out of Moab. But this man of Bethlehem, Judah, he still went to Moab because he did what was right in his own eyes. Bethlehem means
house of bread.
Yep, Bethlehem means house of bread. I just pointed to Mark because I've heard him say that before, actually. Bethlehem means house of bread. It's no accident that it was given that name. It was surrounded by grain fields. And note that it does not say that this man, when he left to go to Moab, and there was a famine, but it doesn't say that he was starving. It just says that he left because there was a famine. But it's interesting to note that from the context you can tell that this man was pretty much the only guy that left. So it wasn't really necessary for him to leave, but for whatever his personal reasons, he decided to move his family to Moab. The Israelites of that day lived on the land that each of them individually lived on, uh, because this was their promised land. And each man resided on his family inheritance, the land that God had given to him. And so let's get this straight. In a time of famine, this man left the house of bread. He left the very fine inheritance that God had given him, and he went to live amongst a people, a cursed people, a people that he had no business living amongst. And I want you to notice a little idiosyncrasy in the story here. The normal way to tell a story is you start off by telling the name of the person, and then you tell what this person did. In this case, the story starts right out of the gate telling us what he did. And then, to the Jewish reader of that era, the first question out of their minds when you tell what he did would be to question, who would do this? Who would leave the house of bread in a time of famine? Who would leave the very fine inheritance that God has given him to go live amongst a cursed and wicked people? The Jewish reader would read this and instantly ask, who did that? To answer that question, we have to go on to the first phrase of verse 2, which reads, the man's name was Elimelech. Here again, the Jewish reader of that era would be surprised, because Elimelech means God is king. The irony of this man's name is striking, because here we have the heart of the whole problem between God and man. Elimelech's very name acknowledges the kingship of God, just as your creation in God's image acknowledges God's kingship. And yet at the same time as his name said one thing, Elimelech did something else entirely. He rejected the inheritance that God gave him, trading it instead for a cursed life. And I know I'm right about making this point, because at least I know that the Jews held a similar view of him to me, because they had a nickname for him in the Midrash. Now, this is probably an oversimplification, but think of the Midrash as a ancient Jewish Bible commentary. And the nickname that Elimelech is given in the Midrash is, hopefully I pronounce this right, Elimelech. That doesn't mean God is king like his actual name does. It means basically he thinks he should be king, or kingship is owed to him. So here in the person of Elimelech, we have the crux of the whole matter between God and man. God is in fact king, but we want to be king. The serpent said in the Garden of Eden, in the day that you eat of the forbidden fruit, you will be like gods. This belief that we can control our own destiny, govern our own lives without God's intervention, this is the great lie of humanity. Ever since the days of Adam, we have lived with this lie. Elimelech, therefore, makes a great type, or we might say an illustration of Adam, whose sin has led us all astray. So let's read on, beginning again in verse 2. And the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the name of his two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they came into the country of Moab and continued there. And Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her two sons. Okay, so this guy that caused all the trouble in the first place, he up and dies. You see, just like Adam has done his damage and then died and left all of us with the mess, that's what Elimelech did to his family. He's left us with the consequences of his decisions. Let's read on verse 4. And they, the sons, took for themselves wives of the women of Moab. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they dwelled there about 10 years. So now we actually really begin to see the folly of Elimelech's decision to leave his inheritance. Elimelech didn't just harm himself by making that decision. He took his two unmarried boys into Moab. Throughout the Bible, God most urgently warned his people not to marry the wicked people in the surrounding nations. And there was no surer way to destruction. There was no surer way to God's judgment. And yet Elimelech took his 2 unmarried sons to a place where the only place they could find wives was amongst foreigners. And it wasn't just any type of foreigners. It was the worst of the worst. It was the Moabites. Talk about burning his bridges. If those sons married, and if they had children, his family would, by God's law, be outcasts from Israel for 10 generations. So right at the beginning of our tale, we see that it seems that Elimelech has driven a wedge between himself and God, between his family and God's family, that it's never going to get repaired. It's an impossible situation. How can it possibly be repaired? You see, whether Elimelech liked it or not, God really was king. And such a great king cannot ignore it when his subjects treat him with contempt and openly violate his laws. So far, depending on the version that you're reading from, so far I've covered about 105 words of this book. In those few words, God has already painted for us a pretty accurate picture of the serious problems that exist between God and man. Because of our ancestors, we who should have had an inheritance in the kingdom of God find ourselves shut out as cursed foreigners. And there doesn't seem to be anything that can be done to make things right. Let's read on. Verse 5. And Mahlon and Chilion died, both of them. And the woman, meaning Naomi, the woman was left of her 2 sons and her husband. In that culture, a woman with no sons and no husband was in deep trouble. Women ate and were housed if they had a woman to work the farm for them. A woman without a man would be forced to beg or starve. There was no government housing, and there were no food stamps. There was no safety net for her. She was in real trouble. Let's read on. Verse 6. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law, that she might return from the country of Moab. For she heard in the country of Moab how that the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread. Now here's an interesting thing. Elimelech's family left God's house of bread to avoid a famine, and doing so brought them death and starvation. Where did they expect to find God providing for his people, if not in his own house of bread? In a time of famine, it says, in a time of famine, God had visited his people in Bethlehem with bread. Jesus, who was born in Bethlehem, said of himself, I am the living bread which came down from heaven. If any man eat of this bread, he shall live forever, and the bread that I will give is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. Jesus is the bread who visited us in Bethlehem in a time of famine. So right when it seems that Elimelech's decision has created problems that can never be solved, God visits Bethlehem with the bread of life. This is a glimmer of hope for a desperate family. But there are still problems that they have no hope of solving. By this point, the inheritance that had been Elimelech's has passed into the possession of others. Other people are working the farm that he once owned. Naomi really has nothing to go home to. Her place in the kingdom of God is lost. And her daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, for their part, they never had any part in the kingdom of God. They really have nothing to go home to. They don't even know anybody. And when they get there, they are excluded by the very law of God from even participating. So let's read on. Therefore, she, meaning Naomi, went forth out of the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. And Naomi said unto her 2 daughters-in-law, Go, return, each of you, to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant you that you may find rest, each of you, in the house of her husband. And then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voice and wept. And they said unto her, Surely we will return with you unto your people. And Naomi said, Turn again, my daughters, why will you go with me? Are there yet any more sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands? Turn again, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, if I should have a husband even tonight, and would also bear sons, would you wait around for them till they were grown? Would you stay from having husbands for them? No, my daughters, for it grieves me much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord is gone out against me. And they lifted up their voice and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth held fast unto her. And Naomi said, Behold, your sister-in-law is gone back unto her people and unto her gods. Return you after your sister-in-law. And Ruth said, Entreat me not to leave you, or to return from following after you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge, and your people will be my people, and thy God, my God. Stop right there. At this moment, that last phrase of what Ruth says, Ruth expresses something that is key to warming the heart of God. She chose to follow him. She chose him. She sought after him. God greatly values those that seek after him. Yeah, situation's impossible. But somebody in that impossible situation sought after him. In Proverbs 8:17, God says, I love those that love me, and those that diligently seek me will find me. There are some interesting things in the next verses, but for the sake of time, let's skip down to verse 22. So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, which returned out of the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem in the beginning of barley harvest. Chapter 2, verse 1. And Naomi had a kinsman of her husband's, a mighty man of wealth, of the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. Now, we've been introduced to a new character in the story right now. His name's Boaz, and it says that he's a man of standing. In fact, from the rest of the book, we know that he's the rich man in town. He's the guy everybody else in town worked for. He's the sort of guy that gets what he wants because of who he is. And furthermore, he's a relative of Naomi's dead husband. So here we have a poverty-stricken old woman and her daughter-in-law from a cursed nation. And here we have the town's rich man living in his big house surrounded by his fields full of laborers. There's one other thing that I want to mention right here. It says that they came to Bethlehem in the beginning of barley harvest. Does anybody know... here's a tough question. I don't think anybody's going to know the answer, but if you do, just shout it out. In the year 2018, what day is the first day of barley harvest? The Bible actually tells you, but you'd have to go combing through things, and so I figured this out. The first day of barley harvest in the year 2018 is today. I told you this was an Easter story. So we are right now on the anniversary of of Ruth and Naomi's arrival in Bethlehem. It just happened to work out that way. I didn't actually. It did. I wanted to do this sermon for Easter, but we'll get into the details of how I know that here in just a minute. But that's an interesting fact. So, happy anniversary. This is the anniversary, and it's not an annual, a certain day of the year. The first day of barley harvest actually moves every year. So it's on a different day every year, but it just so happens that according to the law of God, the first day of barley harvest would be today. Where was I here? Okay, so do you ever skip to the end of a book and just see how the book ends? I never do that, but I know that some of you do. But I want to do that this morning because there's a surprise waiting for us at the end of this book. Let's go over to chapter 4, verse 13. Ruth 4, verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went to her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. Now, it's amazing enough that the poor Moabitess, the cursed woman, ends up catching the eye of the rich man in town. But we all know that a man will lower his standards for a pretty girl, right? So we can see how that might happen. But what's truly amazing is in verses 16 and 17. Then the Lord took the child is Ruth and Boaz's son, and laid him in her lap and cared for him. And the women living there said, Naomi has a son. And they named him Obed. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David. What is amazing about this is that God accepted Ruth. Not that Boaz did. God accepted Ruth. The judgmental, holy God who destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, who demands perfection from his creatures and cannot abide evil, who commanded that the Moabite was not to be allowed into his congregation for 10 generations. That God made an exception to the 10-generation rule for Ruth. And boy, did he ever make an exception. Not only did God make an exception for Ruth, she actually flourished. She had a son named Obed. That's 1 generation. Jesse had a son named David. Named Jesse. No. Obed had a son named Jesse. That's 2 generations. Jesse had a son named David. That's 3 generations. And God himself made David not just a citizen of Israel, the king of Israel. And David was the ancestor of the real man from Bethlehem, the real bread of life, Jesus himself. So if you're sitting here today and you know that you don't measure up to God's standard of perfection, that should be all of us, because the Bible says that all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. And you're sitting here realizing that a perfect God, by his very nature, would require judgment on you. Does it help to know that God made an exception for the descendant of a bastardized, incestuous people, for a woman who once worshipped a God who required child sacrifice? Does the fact that God made an exception for her strike you as hopeful? If God made a way for her, is it possible that he might make a way for you and me? If you're viewing this thing realistically, you know that you can never do anything to be in your own power to make yourself right with God. The only thing that you can ever do to be right with God is if he finds a way to let you off the hook without you ever doing anything good enough to deserve it. But how? How can a holy God make an exception? Doesn't his nature demand justice? Maybe if you can understand how the exception works, in the case of Ruth, maybe you'll understand how he might make an exception for you. and let you into his family. I realize for a lot of you, or probably all of you, this is a review, but we talk about this exception that God has made to let us into his family in all kinds of different ways, because the Bible gives us many illustrations. And this one in Ruth is just one illustration of that. So now I've told you the beginning of the story. I've told you the end of the story. The only thing that's left is for me to tell you how God made an exception in Ruth's case. So let's go back and read some of the things that we skipped over. Actually, let's go back to the last verse of the first chapter, which I read already rather quickly. So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, and they returned out of the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem in the beginning of barley harvest. Now, we're going to get real technical with something in the Bible, so you're going to kind of have to amp up your ability to pay attention. We'll get through this and we'll get back into the more interesting stuff, but we're going to talk for a few minutes about barley. Now, why is barley? Barley is just a crop. There's lots of things we eat. We don't get into detail about things that we eat in our culture. Why talk about what the Jews ate? Well, barley is a very important crop in the Bible. And since we don't live in those days, there's something I need to explain to you. Well, there's things to explain to you about the symbolism of that food as it's used in the Bible, but there's also something I need to explain to you if you happen to be using a King James Version. The King James Version of the Bible was translated at a time when the word for any grain that had a head on it was corn. And so now, these days, we use the word corn for the type of grain that's actually really called maize. And so we use the word corn for maize. But in this passage, if you happen to be using a King James Version, it's going to call the crop that they're harvesting here corn. It was actually barley. Just the more modern translations have accurately translated that according to the modern English usage, but just wanted to make you aware of that in case you're using a King James Version. The barley was central to the entire system of worship. Instead of using a solar calendar based on 365 and a quarter days per year, the Jews used a lunar calendar. And to complete a cycle of the moon, if you go from new moon to new moon, complete cycle of the moon takes about 29 and a half days. And that means that in a 12-month calendar, there are only 354 days. So every year they lost, with a 12 months and a lunar calendar, every year they would lose about 11 and a quarter days. Well, if you go on year after year losing 11 and a quarter days, it doesn't take very long at all for your whole calendar to get out of whack with the seasons, right? So you got to do something about that. And so God actually told them what to do about that. And it was based on the growth of barley. As barley ripens, it goes through different stages, and one of those stages is called Abib or Aviv. Abib means green in the head. Okay, and at this stage, when barley comes into Abib, it is actually edible. But you can't harvest it yet because it's still green. And so if you harvested it and you tried to pound it into flour, you would pound it into paste instead. And so it can't be harvested until the stalk dies and grows brittle. And so when barley comes into Abib, it will be brown enough to harvest in about 2 weeks. I think it's interesting that when the Jews returned to the land of Palestine, they named the main city that they founded there Tel Aviv, a precursor to the coming resurrection that the Bible seems to indicate is soon upon us. In Palestine, barley comes into Abib in the spring. And the Jews used the timing of that barley crop to regulate their calendar. In fact, the first month of their calendar, during which the barley always comes ripe, they called Abib. When I was a kid and my parents read the Bible to me, they called it Abib, because they didn't know how to pronounce it. And I think I'm pronouncing it right, but I don't think it's Abib. And so, by God's mandate, they were to celebrate the Passover on the 14th day from the first sliver of the moon that marked the beginning of the month of Abib. So they were not allowed by law to harvest their barley until after they had celebrated the Passover. So here's how it worked. At the end of the 12th lunar month of a given year, when the moon first became a new moon, at the end of that 12th lunar cycle, the Jews would go out into the barley fields on the night of the first sliver of the next phase of the moon, showing the beginning of the next cycle, and there they would examine the barley to see if it had come into Abib. In other words, they would check to see if the barley, though still green, was fully developed inside the heads of grain. If the grain was in Abib, they would plan to celebrate the Passover in 14 days. The grain had to at least be in Abib because it takes 2 weeks for the grain to dry out after harvesting, or after Abib, and for them to harvest it. And if you read God's law concerning the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread that immediately followed the Passover, you'll find that the barley had to be ready for harvesting by Passover, because harvested barley was necessary to the events of these days. Now, if they went out into the field on the night of the first sliver moon and they found that the barley was not yet in Abib, because their short calendar year had kind of slipped it up a little, they had slipped off enough that the barley wasn't ready yet, they would at that point insert a 13th month into the year, and that would push the month of Abib back by 1 moon cycle. And that would allow the barley to be fully ripe by the time the Passover came about the following month. They would still have to wait for Passover in order to harvest the barley. So why am I telling you all these details about barley? The reason is that I want to make a case to you that barley is a great illustration of the resurrected Christ. First of all, you can have no Passover without barley. God's law required that they use barley for the events surrounding Passover. Passover, of course, is a great illustration of the substitutionary sacrifice in which God withheld judgment on those people that had the blood of the Lamb painted on the doorframe of their houses. And by law, there could be no Passover until the barley was ripe and until it had died. They had to wait. As it says in Galatians 4:4, God sent forth his Son when the fullness of time had come. God sent forth his Son. Not only do you need barley to have Passover, as I said already, the barley must die first. There's no harvest until it's dry and brittle. This year, as in the year when Christ was crucified, the Passover occurred on this past Friday. And that means that the Passover occurred on the day before the Sabbath. So the Saturdays are Sabbath, and so the Passover was on Friday. The next day was the Sabbath. These are as it says in the 23rd chapter of Leviticus, these are the feasts of the Lord, even holy convocations, which you shall proclaim in their seasons. In the 14th day of the first month at evening is the Lord's Passover. We already talked about that. The Passover is to begin on the 14th day of the first month of their year. Let's read on. On the 15th day of the same month is the Feast of Unleavened Bread unto the Lord. 7 days you must eat the unleavened bread. In the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall do no servile work therein. But you shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord 7 days. And the seventh day is a holy convocation. You shall do no servile or manual work therein. Okay, so in the beginning, on the 15th day of the first month of their lunar calendar, they were to have a week called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now, we've talked about this before from this pulpit, but leaven in the modern day is what we typically call yeast. It's used throughout the Bible as a symbol of sin. Jesus said, "Watch out for the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees." And he also warned to be aware of the leaven of Herod. And Paul wrote, "Your glorying is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Therefore purge out the old leaven, so that you may be a new lump, since you are truly unleavened. For Christ indeed, our Passover, was sacrificed for us. Let us therefore keep the feast, not with old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth." 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Yeast makes a pretty good illustration of sin because it constantly grows. It completely permeates everything that it gets into, and it fundamentally changes the nature of everything that it invades. So following the celebration of the Passover, they were to celebrate 7 days of eating no leaven. Seven is a number that was associated with the concept of completeness. So the implication, therefore, is that the 7 days of unleavened bread was that the slaying of the Passover lamb brought about a complete solution to the problem of sin. 7 days of unleavened bread following the slaying of the Passover lamb. Now, let's read on. It says in the same passage, "The Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When you come into the land which I give you, you shall reap the harvest thereof, and you reap the harvest thereof. Then you shall bring a sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest unto the priest. And he shall wave the sheaf before the Lord, to be accepted for you. On the morrow after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it." Okay, so here's where we get into why today is the beginning of barley harvest. They were not allowed to harvest any of their harvest until the day after the Sabbath that would occur during the week of unleavened bread. Well, it just so happens that the week following Passover this year begins with a Sabbath. So today is the day after the Sabbath in the week of unleavened bread. And when they harvested this barley, it says they were to bring the first fruits of that harvest to the priest. And he was supposed to do something with it. He was supposed to wave it before God. Now, the reason that the passage specifically says the reason that they were supposed to wave it before God was for their acceptance. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 20 through 23 says, "But now is Christ risen from the dead and become the first fruits of them that slept. For since by man came death, by man also came the resurrection from the dead. For as in Adam all die, even so in Christ shall all be made alive. But every man in his own order. Christ, the first fruits, and afterward they that are Christ's at his coming." Jesus, by sacrificing his life, became our Passover lamb. By his death, by his sacrifice, we need not fear God's judgment. The Bible says that he has broken down the middle wall that parts us. He has become the first fruits of our resurrection, waved in the very face of God, proof that death is conquered, sin is removed. I talked about how Elimelech was like Adam and that he badly messed everything up till there was no hope of recovery. I told you how that Ruth, for her part, never had any hope of recovery in the first place. I guess it's a good thing that Naomi and Ruth showed up in Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. It was the time of year when impossible problems get solved. It was Easter time. There's so much more that could be said on the topic of barley. I'll say a couple of minor things in a moment. And we've really only scratched the surface of that incredible grain that God has used as an illustration in His Word. If you think that barley is an interesting topic, you might read Joshua chapter 5, 2 Kings chapter 4, or John chapter 6. Let's return to Ruth, chapter 2, verse 1. And Naomi had a kinsman of her husband's, a mighty man of wealth, of the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. That's interesting. Naomi had a relative. He was a very smart, wealthy, successful landowner from the town of Bethlehem. And my friends, when you think about the mess that naturally exists between you and God, does it help to know that you too have a wealthy and influential relative from Bethlehem? By coming to earth and being born in Bethlehem, the high King of heaven became a human, just like you. And as it says in the book of Hebrews, we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses. But we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, and yet he did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Let's read on in Ruth chapter 2, verse 2. And Ruth the Moabitess said unto Naomi, Let me go now to the field, and glean ears of corn after him in whose sight I shall find grace. And she said unto her, Go, my daughter. And she went, and she came and gleaned in the field after the reapers. What's this gleaning business? Okay, so God had told His people not to be too careful when they harvested their food, not to get every last little bit of food out of the fields. And the reason for that was that if anyone in that culture had fallen on hard times, they could go out after the field had been picked, and they could find enough food there to subsist on. That was the safety net. So after they'd harvested the field, then the poor folks would come out and they'd get anything that was left. And God told them, don't strip that field bare. You make sure there's something there for those people. And so that's what Ruth went out to do. And it says, if we read on, it says she happened to come to a field, or a part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the kindred of Elimelech. So now we've been introduced to the Lord of the harvest, which is the name that Jesus gave Himself in Matthew 9 and Luke 10. And if we skip down to verse 14, Boaz said to Ruth, At mealtime you come here and eat of the bread and dip your morsel in the vinegar. And she sat beside the reapers, which would be his hired help. She sat beside them, and he reached for her parched barley, and she did eat, and she was full, and she left. She was in his fields as a poor Moabite beggar looking for scraps. Boaz gave her a place at the table. And it says, when she was risen up to glean, Boaz commanded his young men, saying, Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. In other words, he told his workers, not to bother her if she took extra grain right out of the stuff they'd already reaped. Verse 16. He said, and also intentionally let fall some of your handfuls and leave them, so that she may glean them, and do not rebuke her. So he told his workers to intentionally drop extra barley out in front of her. You see, the Lord of the harvest does not just allow her to scavenge in his fields like some low-class foreigner. He went out of his way to make sure that she had even more than she needed. And Jesus said, I am the bread of life. He that comes to me will never hunger. Jesus also said, so he that eateth me, even he shall live by me. This is the bread that came down from heaven, not as your fathers did eat manna and are dead. He that eateth of this bread shall live forever. Well, I mentioned manna there. So, manna was the bread that came from heaven that the children of Israel ate when they wandered in the desert. They stopped getting that bread and switched to the bread from the land when they crossed the Jordan River under the leadership of Joshua. And what time of year did they cross the Jordan River under Joshua? Well, the book of Joshua tells us that it was at the time of barley harvest. In 2 Kings chapter 4, there's a man that brought of the first fruits of his barley harvest, and he gave it to Elisha. Now, the priest in those days had gotten pretty wicked, and so he thought, well, I'm going to take it to a prophet instead of the priest. Remember, the Bible said, take those first fruits and take them to the house of God. So this man, instead of exactly obeying the commandment, he took his first fruits to Elisha. And this is in 1 Kings 4, but we're not going to read it, but I'm just going to tell you about it. What he brought was not enough barley to feed all the men that Elisha had to look out for, all the guys that were relying on him for their sustenance. But it says that Elisha fed them with it anyway. And it says that those people ate until they were full, and there was some left over. And in the same chapter, in that very same chapter, it says there was poison in the stew. And Elisha told them to throw in barley, and the stew was no longer poisonous. And in John 6, when Jesus fed the 5,000 with 5 loaves and 2 fish, guess what kind of grain was used in those loaves that Jesus broke up? Ruth had found the Lord of the harvest. Ruth would never be hungry again. Let's skip down to the end of verse 19. And Ruth told Naomi, this man's name with whom I work today is Boaz. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, blessed be he of the Lord, who has not left off his kindness to the living and the dead. And Naomi said to her, the man is of near kin to us. He is one of our next kinsmen. Now, it appears that Ruth probably didn't understand what was so special about the fact that Boaz was one of their near kinsmen. How could she? She was a Moabite. She didn't know the customs of Israel. But when God set up the laws of Israel under the leadership of Moses, he made special arrangements for a special type of person whom the Hebrews referred to as a goel. In English, we refer to that person as a kinsman redeemer. Some of the modern English translations have a slightly different variation of that word, but let's say kinsman redeemer, a relative redeemer, a relative rescuer. A kinsman redeemer was a special kind of person, and he had special authority under the law of God to look out for the interest of his relatives. So if you got into trouble in that culture, you hoped that one of your relatives would come to your rescue as your kinsman redeemer. Let's say a poor person was forced to sell off part of his property, or maybe even indenture himself into servitude because he had gotten into debt. His nearest kin could step up and buy back what his relative had been forced to sell, according to Leviticus 25:48. And that kinsman redeemer, he was a rich benefactor. The person who had bought the property could not refuse to sell to him by law. It says in Leviticus 25, if a fellow countryman of yours becomes so poor that he has to sell part of his property, then his nearest kinsman is to come and buy back what his relative has sold. And also remember that in that culture, if a woman ended up with no man to take care of her, she was in a tough situation. And so the law of the kinsman redeemer allowed for a family member, if a woman died without an heir, without a son to take care of her, the closest kinsman was to marry that widow, and if possible, give her a son to hand down the lost relatives, the lost male relatives' lineage, to provide a son for that man who died early. So if you find yourself in a mess with God and in need of a kinsman redeemer, God has provided one for us. Or if you find yourself with an aching hunger that's never satisfied, then you need the Lord of the harvest to provide you with the bread of heaven. So there's just one question that remains. How on earth do you convince the Lord of the harvest to redeem you? The answer is that you can do what Ruth did. Look in chapter 3, verse 2. And here Naomi advised Ruth that that night Boaz was winnowing barley in the threshing floor. Now, what does it mean to be winnowing barley? Okay, so when grain is grown, the edible outer husk is the outer husk of that grain is inedible. And so what has to happen is the grain has to be crushed. And then when the grain is crushed, it separates from the inedible part separates from the edible part. And they take these big shovels or big forks and they throw the grain up in the air, and the wind blows the inedible part away. The edible part falls back down to the ground. Throughout the Bible, threshing floors are used symbolically of judgment. There are several examples, one of which is 1 Chronicles 21, and another was Psalm number 2, and Luke 3:17. So Naomi advises Ruth to go meet Boaz at the threshing floor, and there to ask him to play a role as her redeemer. And you too, if you want the Lord of the harvest to redeem you, you must meet him at the place of judgment. Just as grain is crushed on the threshing floor, so too Isaiah tells us that he was crushed for our iniquities. His punishment, the punishment that brought us peace, was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. Let's skip down to chapter 3, verse 9. Ruth says to Boaz, so Ruth has gone to Boaz. She found him. She actually caught him sleeping. It was at night. And he woke up with a start. And here's what she says to Boaz. I am Ruth, your handmaid. Spread therefore your skirt over your handmaid, for you are a near kinsman. There are two things that are implied here. First of all, in Bible times, the hem of the robe that was down near their feet, they would wear on the hem of their robe, they would wear any insignias of their rank. You know, in the modern day, if you're a police officer or military man, you'll see either a symbol of rank on the collar or on the shirt sleeve. At that time, they would wear the symbol of rank at the hem of the robe. That's why in the time of Jesus, it tells us that people sought to touch the hem of his robe. It was a recognition that they saw the authority that Jesus taught with. And it's also why when King David, it tells us that one time King David caught Saul in a cave, and he cut off part of the hem of his robe. Well, it was David's way of saying, I could have had you, but instead I just took the symbol of your authority. And the second thing that's implied, and we talked about this at communion last week, and that is that robes are associated with righteousness. Zechariah chapter 3 is a good example of that. In like manner, if you want Jesus to play the role of kinsman redeemer in your life, you must meet him at the place of judgment, which is the cross. And on the basis of what he has done on the cross, you must place yourself under his authority and request that your own moral failures be covered by the righteousness of Christ. There's one final thing to consider. That's what you have to do to get the kinsman redeemer. There's something that you don't do, and it's also illustrated in the book of Ruth, and we're almost done here. But if you read the rest of Ruth chapter 3 and the first half of Ruth chapter 4, you find that Boaz tells Ruth that there's actually a closer relative. And this closer relative has the first right of redemption if he wants it. And so before Boaz will commit to redeem, the closer relative must be given the option to redeem. And Boaz then talks to this relative, and the relative decides that he cannot redeem. We have a closer relative, a closer kinsman than Christ. This closer kinsman is the law of God. We know he's closer. We deal with him every day, don't we? The law of God. And if you could get it all right and obey the law of God, yeah, that would work. But you can't. That kinsman will never redeem you. You can't be good enough to obey the law of God. That kinsman will never redeem you. You need somebody else. And that is the role that Jesus plays in the Bible. He is our kinsman redeemer, the first fruits of our resurrection, the bread of life, the rich relative who looks out for our interests. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. We'll be done. Dear Heavenly Father, you have given us such a rich story in this book of Ruth. And I'm sure there's so much in this story that I've never even spotted. And I just thank you for providing this illustration of your very rich and free and very great salvation. I pray that if there is anyone here today that does not know you as their kinsman redeemer, that you would lead them in their thinking, change them in their approach to life, give them the light that they need to see what you have done for them and how you wish to be their Redeemer. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.